Yeah, so it would be great, Jamie, so yeah, I was going in and out of the garden. I was writing these poems. I believe that you, from your, in your perspective, have been doing the same thing. This is what's so much fun about our meeting. It has really been like a synergy. Can you talk a little bit about how you got to creating plants and poetry?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I do know, I feel like plants and poetry, it is so niche. And so when someone stumbles across our organization, like Lucia, they're very much aligned with, what we do on an everyday basis, whether that is gardening or, admiring wildlife around us. And then literacy, of course, with poetry. And so that is really where plants and poetry started. It was finding like-minded people that were inspired by both of those. At the time, and when we founded it in 2019, my roommate, she had a real knack for bringing sick plants to life. And so we noticed that friends would come to us and bring us their plants. And it became, a lot bigger than we anticipated. And so we ended up bringing that same idea to a festival. It was a Lavender Festival in 2019, and we decided to write a poem for every plant that we had brought with us. So while we were nursing plants back to health and then giving them back to people, other people were just giving us plants. I've got this old ficus that I need, you to take care of, you can have it, whatever. So we wrote poems for each of these plants. We had coleus, philodendron, all aligned on this table, and we wrote a poem for each plant. And after the festival, people came up to us and were asking us to write a poem for another plant that they had, like a lily or a rose or an orchid. So that idea sort of just spun into us trying to create more of a community and inspiring others to write their own poems for their own plants, which is where Plants and Poetry Journal was born. And so we now have, over 100 contributors from around the world that are writing poems inspired by plants or, maybe soil. We have a couple different issues about mycorrhiza fungi, about water, aquatic plants. So it varies. We're just trying to, harness this community where people can publish their work, share it with others. Our journal's available online for free. And then of course, you can buy the hard copies. And then Lucia is actually the very
if some of you can mute yourselves while we're just because there's a little bit of
Okay, can you guys hear me? Everyone hear me okay? Awesome. Okay. So yeah, Lucia was the very first author we published as like their own sole poetry collection. And it was wonderful to work with her and sort of just walk through the process of bringing inspiration that she might find in her garden or in and around the world into one body of work. So that's the whole story with plants and poetry. One thing I didn't mention was that for our journal, for all those submissions that we receive, we plant, initially we started planting trees, but we said this is too many trees. We need to diversify the landscape. So for every submission we receive, we plant a seed in a growing community food forest in Bella Vista, Arkansas. And so now we've got, florals, shrubs, trees, all in this about 2 acres. And we've got over 70 different species that are, growing and thriving. And we're trying to use different, methods to ensure that the plants are growing well together. So we've got, a family of oak trees where we're planting sage. And then at the time, the property was having some bad flooding. So we were thinking, what species are very comparable with the landscape, with the soil, and with the species that are already native to the land. So there's elderberry, goldenrod, a lot of things that are native to Arkansas. So it's all really just been, very intentional and interactive to taking the space and turning it into its own community, which is also what we're doing with the journal. We're documenting the progress of this food forest in each journal issue. So people are bringing in their experience of the plants that are around them. And then we're also, nurturing this like place-based education, showing them that we have this space that now we are, nurturing the plants around it, and then doing certain techniques where we really narrate that in poetry in these collections. And so I guess that is one question I know that Lucia and I wanted to cover was, what role does community play in poetry? I think, Lucia, you should be able to unmute yourself.
Sorry.
Awesome.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. So the thing is that nature, is our common ground. That's what's so incredible. It is our capital and it is our common ground. And this is, very important as we, move toward a more regenerative ecology and economy. And this is something I'm really feeling more and more strongly all the time. But going back to, when I was writing, Talking with Trees, around that same time, I started doing Contra Dancing in Paris. So I was walking around in nature and enjoying that. And I had started Contra Dancing, which was so much fun. For those of you who have never done it, it is just a blast, really. And it is this wonderful moment of people, coming together and standing on the circle, in a circle, in the round, and, performing these very simple steps with a caller. It's really country dancing. It's a joy, and you're doing it with all kinds of people, young, old, people you don't know. And it's really, it seems like humanity in that moment is so beautiful and at its best. And, but I was haunted by thoughts also, my imagination always running away with me, of how also the group can be so dangerous. Human beings, when they come together, can be so beautiful and can be so terrifying as well. Images of, primitive sacrifices, maypole dances that turn into lynchings, or, the mob. And so that was kind of going around in my head. And what was also interesting was that I was in my imagination, as I was dancing, I was constantly projecting myself into a natural space, even though we were in fact in high school gyms and not very beautiful spaces. But in my head, we were somewhere in the forest, in a clearing, and it was all very magical. So this is a poem. I'm going to read The Clearing now, which is from towards the beginning of my book. So The Clearing. Our boots are clumped with mud, and on our backs we carry little wings. We gather for the circle dance, and sprouting roots we take hands in the round. But it's when the dance takes off that the journey really begins, with time reeling, thumping, treading towards the taking off of us with our wings into the air. Pirouetting with the beat, we skip with the glide, the float and pause, as further down the earth has become a refrain, point of stillness darker with a more introspective vibrancy, then silence, briefly pausing before the next upbeat and rest. The great adventure takes place in the air, where the song is best sung with lyrics implying questions about what may be the next stopping off, how long for each moment to weave itself like a tale of enchantment into that thing that laughs and sighs and weeps at night. Rituals of carnage, rituals of peace. This moment exists despite the possibility that severed heads may be on maypoles not so far away. We choose to be the antidote to the lynching mobs, to the townsfolk that taunt, torture, tease, and have the audacity to cast shadows. To them we answer stomping down upon the darkness as our laughter winds its way past dusk towards dawn, echoing between the Branle and the Gigue. Once again we hold hands, knowing never to forget. Dearly we pay for decisions we make, and dearly we pray. We stutter and we kiss. Does the realization of who we are now bring with it the gentleness of grace? Perhaps. At least the sun above and the water below will have touched, as again and again the circle is cast, and again we go round. How far we are then from those coldest of cold winter nights. Sweet pilgrimage with children, elders and songs with truest meanings. Sweet legs, feet, fingers that grasp this golden rule of our entwinement. Our sweat glistens like clouds that gather, then stream down with rain. For in this place the circle of light beckons, with each rise and fall. Quiet like the Empyrean echo of a bagpipe, a breath that billows and spirals round a core, As rhythm calls to gather, rhythm calls to scatter, gather and scatter, then follow its way around again and back to a circular pause. So yeah, those were thoughts on common ground. And I wanted to ask you, Jamie, about how you all came to the name of calling the space that in Arkansas, the Oasis. Could you talk a little bit about, the words that we use, the names that we give places? How did the Oasis come to be?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the Oasis is ran and stewarded by Leslie Walker. She is my partner at Plants and Poetry. And she actually came in later on. So I had the roommate I mentioned earlier, who started the organization with me, and she moved on to new things. And she introduced me to Leslie Walker, who is an integrative health teacher. She works with various groups and introduces natural sugars, and she's a wonderful chef. So she definitely takes food as medicine as her main approach. And so she was telling me that she wanted to create a space where people could come, be with nature and really just sit with themselves as they're working through this process of really just turning their life around through food. And she had, envisioned a space that was outside of her home. Maybe it was, at a community center or somewhere that was a little bit out of reach at the moment, because she had a 5-year-old son at the time. And so I said, well, what if we just turned your backyard into this space, somewhere that you could go that was easily accessible, that you could welcome people into. She's also very active in the community where she lives. So we said, you've got about 2 acres behind you, and there's also a lot that was next to her that they're in the process of acquiring for this project. So that was really the idea of where the space came from. And she had always just envisioned this place being called the Oasis. She named it, but she never imagined that it would be in her own house or in her backyard. But I do think that it definitely sets the foundation for how she's already nourished her backyard in so many beautiful ways by having a garden, and then she loves to interact with the deer and feed the birds. And so she was just really cultivating the space that was so natural already, and now she's able to grow and get support from me with the journal, and that's also where the food forest was born, because she was going to the farmer's market and doing all these other things to incorporate natural and organic foods into her clientele's diet. And so we said, what if we just grow it ourselves? We've got 2 acres, it's plenty. And she was also had so many other native plants that she never really thought would be part of their diet. So she started to utilize, like I mentioned before, the elderberry. She was even using some of the plants that aren't edible, the pokeberry, to create art with. So then the integrative health ended up not only being about food, but it became about what people would do in their free time. Rather than scrolling on their phone, it was maybe painting or writing poetry. So we kind of just intersect both of our passions, and then created the space that serves different communities, no matter what they're looking at, whether they are like I said, doing food, or maybe they're doing more arts. It's just really ways for us to bridge those two, the science and the arts, together. So now the Oasis is slowly growing, but she's definitely the one that's been nurturing that still growing space.
Okay, yeah, I feel as though just even cultivating a garden exposes us to so many words. The names of the plants are concepts in and of themselves. And I would like it if you could talk a little bit more actually about the words, just with your background in agroforestry. Could you talk about that, Jamie, before I read the poem Maps? Yeah, that would be cool, because talking about words and just the intelligence that they give us. I recently learned that a children's dictionary had left out certain words like swamp and fern and dandelion to make way for other words like MP3 player and bullet points. And yeah, that really scares me, because I feel that as we lose touch with nature, we lose touch with concepts and ideas that are so important for us to learn and grow. So as a scientist, Jamie, what is what have you learned from your background in agroforestry.
Yeah, so I started studying agroforestry while we were doing plants and poetry because I did want to become more immersed into the things I was writing about. Because rather than taking the poetry at a more abstract approach and my feelings towards plants, it was like, what are these plants actually doing for me and for this environment? And so as I've learned through agroforestry, it's a term that was coined probably in the 1970s, although agroforestry itself, if you're not familiar, it's similar to maybe like a permaculture approach or regenerative agriculture. It's taking agriculture and forestry and merging the two. So in agroforestry, there are four main criteria for it to be an agroforestry system. It has to be intentional, interactive, integrative, and intensive. So interactive meaning the plants are supposed to be supporting one another. Intentional means it needs to be applicable to the cultures and the societies that are surrounding those practices. So Leslie, being Cherokee, her culture and her grandmother, they were always using certain plants in their recipes. And so why would she, be integrating all of these new plants that aren't really necessary to their diet? And much like in other communities, we have all these different plants that we might be growing on mass scales, corn and soybean, while they do feed us. Like, how aligned are they with the cultures that are in those regions? So agroforestry, it needs to be that. It needs to be intentional, interactive, integrative. So, the trees that are planted are supporting the canopies underneath. And then intensive. It does take a lot more work. You might be burning shrubs more often, weeding, you might be clearing, pruning some of the trees because you have more trees versus just, row crops. So those are the four main I's, they call them. But I would also like to add like the fifth I, which, like you said, our words are so powerful, and it's indigenous, because agroforestry may have been coined in the 1970s, but indigenous communities have been using these techniques for a millennial. They've been, having riparian buffers along the rivers to make sure that soil and sediment doesn't go into the river, or that it's not, leaching any of the pollutants that are in the soil into our water sources. They might use silvopasture. Many of us know that buffalo were a large part of different tribes' diet, and they were stewarding the land with the buffalo. It was like a relationship between both. And so silvopasture is the idea of taking livestock and agriculture and mixing them together, because then obviously the animals need to eat, but by rotationally grazing them, they're not overfeeding the land or hurting the environment. It's really helping it. And then there's also windbreaks. So I'm actually in Morocco currently. And so there's a lot of indigenous cultures here. So the Amazigh culture, for example, they use windbreaks, which are a row of trees or tall shrubs that will actually be lined up against the fence line, or where a fence would be, in order to protect the soil from wind and water erosion. And so that's like a very ancient old practice that has been used here for a very, very long time. And so, yeah, indigenous is definitely a key part of what agroforestry is and what it means to really care for the land.
Yeah, one of the things that's so exciting also is the idea that, as we look closer at nature and reforge that link, I realize that, we have this capacity to shape nature, and it shapes us. And this is a reciprocal relationship. I think that this poem Maps is a little bit talking about that, actually. I think so maps, there are all kinds of them. The ones we keep folded up in the car and never look at, and those from grade school that get transported by animals. Turtles, I recall. Those that say if you go too far, you'll fall off the edge of the world, that make you think you're going east to India, when actually it's to the other side. And then lots and lots of new maps need to be made, with directions for heaven and hell, the invisible, the obvious, timelines of the past, crystal balls for the future right now. Whether round, flat, linear, photographed by satellite, or drawn with a stick in the sand, they all try to show a picture of how it is. It helps if they come with a key. Today we're leaving the house with skateboards, bathing suits, sandwiches. We could do this day with our eyes closed, except that the sky is clear and there are rhododendrons all over the place, the most beautiful fuchsia that I've ever seen. They're there as I take out my car keys and drive past the other houses, and there as I remember events with different shades of familiarity, dinners, block parties, the throwing of wayward soccer balls over fences, echoes of laughter, cries of pain, conversations in the yard, the perpetual opening and closing of doors. These many things are recorded in our thoughts over time. And the rhododendrons are there as we sit on the grass. They nod at the odd four-leaf clover and the dandelion for a wish, and look on as we drive back home past the park, the school, the grocer, the graveyard and church, and then again once we arrive at home, wondering, how long does the blossoming last? Does this particular map inform us about destiny or fate? Or does it just speak of the day, a map of the day, or more specifically of moments that flash forth sideways, sassy like lipstick and painted toenails, leaving an impression seductive and bold? Today is a day of fuchsia with rhododendrons all over the place. Each blossom is specific to itself, just as each of us dwells here with ancestries from far away, China, Siberia, the Alps. We are in this place today, and the radiant petals of this flower are effusive with color from the sun. This is what I see as my car key makes a click. This is what I'm looking for, and this is what I see. So, yeah, so something about, how nature shapes us and we shape it as ways of seeing, another thing that was really interesting as I was writing, in the process of writing originally these poems, was I read, I became really aware that this journey into the wilderness is a little bit like Alice going down the rabbit hole, and shrinking and growing. And I became very much aware also of the stories really that nature is telling us. I read a wonderful book called The Gardener of Versailles by a man called Alain Baraton, who is in fact the Gardener of Versailles, and he has been since 1983. And it's so exciting, this book, because he talks about the history of Versailles, but through the plants and the trees and the surrounding forest, the flowers, the fountains, everything that's there. And I realized at that point, really, that in fact, we can relate to nature, but it really is relating back to us, because the trees, like us, have a history that is social and political and economic, as well as biological and physical. And so this is what I was thinking about. And my poem, The River, is very much about that. It's really a fantasy about this intertwining of our lives with nature. And I will read The River. It's about time, about this river, whose tree-lined banks we've ambled along with its barges, buildings, and bridges. It's about seagulls flying in deft alignment along its corridor in spring, and about the song that an accordionist plays here, along this same river as it ripples and flows. There's something nostalgic in the shifting, muddy waters of a river, something of memory and change, and right now. History is one thing. It begins long ago in the Bronze Age with Gaul settlements in earthen huts and flows past Notre Dame, the Louvre, the Eiffel Tower. It begins at its source in the Alps and flows into an estuary at the channel between England and France. From its banks, we carry back many things which, like the skins of fish, are discarded, though beautiful. And then there's memory. The original settlers recorded their world in a prism of trees. They had a secret language called Akham, which was spoken using fingers as letters to communicate about the body and the seasons. We are constantly retrieving odd things from the past as we amble along with the persistent river's flow. We dive down into the silt with our thoughts and then emerge as if to align them. like the lindens and poplars and planes along the Seine. This is what we're doing when we journey down to these banks, and one thing always leads to another. The sound of a siren, a foghorn, an accordion, even the rustle of leaves is evocative here, and this is where history and memory briefly disconnect and recombine in the feeling of what's present. Just now, as the accordionist plays, it makes less of a picture than an impression. It's a community dance on the banks of the Seine just after the Second World War in late spring. Lanterns are strung around a linden tree. There are tables and chairs and many people of all ages dancing. There's an ambiance of gaiety that affirms itself with their steps on the post-war gravel beneath their feet. A man and a woman are gazing into each other's eyes. They share the same glass of wine. They're dressed up, though simply. She wears a red dress with a delicate floral pattern. Her sandals are high-heeled but worn. He wears a white shirt that's tucked into his trousers with a belt. The shirt is slightly wrinkled and the cuffs are rolled up. They're young and look into one another's eyes with such desire that everything else recedes into a lantern-lit haze. This is the picture, although the exact time and place are impossible to recall. I know it's somewhere by the river, and I try to imagine who the man and woman are. The look in her eyes is so familiar that I wonder if she couldn't be me. The feeling is such that I'm not sure if it's a memory or a wish, and the accordion plays. Ce dont je me souviens, c'est qu'ils étaient heureux, les yeux au fond des yeux, et c'était bien. Yes, it was good. So, yeah, the places that we go to. So the Seine, obviously, the forest around Meudon were very important to me during this time that I was writing. The Seine, the city of Paris. And so I wanted to ask everyone, what are the spaces that we gravitate towards just when we're dreaming about, our imaginations? Where do you all go? I wanted to ask Jamie first, and then I kind of want to open it up to everybody else. Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like right now that I'm in Morocco, my space is the river at home in Arkansas, probably the Buffalo River. But it's wild because before I moved to Morocco, it was this specific town in Morocco. It was this place called Chefchaouen. And it was one of the weekends where I first really spent with my husband when we were just friends, probably, 6-7 years ago. But now that I'm here, far away from my mother and my sisters and brother, it definitely is now out of reach. I'm here where I thought I was, where my dream space was. And now that I've been here for 3 years, my mind is definitely migrating towards home, where I'm from. But I believe if anyone can unmute now, so the floor is open.
This is Kim. I would say that similar to you, before I moved to Amsterdam back in 2018, I dreamt of being in Amsterdam, like literally just, daydreaming and in my sleep, because I had spent a sabbatical in Amsterdam. And I'd be on these cobblestone streets with these old churches and et cetera, et cetera. And that's where I wanted to be. And then having been here for 4 years almost, I find myself like dreaming of like being in nature. It's like next to a sea or with, big open skies. Of course, the Dutch skies are big, but we don't have much nature. So I think it's just typical that we crave the thing that we don't have. And when I'm in the countryside, I lived in Santa Cruz for years. I had the redwood forests around me, and I really missed cities. Now that I'm in a city, I really miss countryside. Now I'll mute myself and let someone else talk.
Carla, go ahead. Yeah.
Oh, I didn't think this at all because I'm in right in Berkeley, and there's many lovely places. But when you talked, I said, the Hudson River, childhood. Ay, 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 ay. I suddenly realized I loved it. I always remember walks I'd take with my father looking for mica. around along up the Hudson and in the hundreds, let's say 90s, hundreds or so. Um, I walked toward the Hudson River after I was baptized, as I'm a convert. But that's where I took the subway back home, walked toward the Hudson, and that became a magical spot. Well, it's enough to say now. I'm not sure that's a spot I want to go to as I'm looking for what's ahead for me, but that suddenly had a warm feeling. Thank you. Someone else now. I know had little time.
For me, I think I'm Shoshana. There's a component for me about walking on the St. James Way, the Camino de Santiago, where I think it's not just about feeling at home in the landscape, in the nature, in the constructed community, but in the transitions between those states. So for me, movement is a really powerful component of that Heimlich feeling. If I'm just standing still somewhere in Spain, I don't feel it so much. But if I'm in motion with the landscape, I have a very powerful sense of that.
Yeah, and actually Shoshana just wrote a very beautiful book, by the way. Shoshana, could you just talk briefly about your book? We're going to be
Sure.
cut off at 40 minutes, but it would be nice just for you to, because it's also about that Camino that she did and the idea of the journey. Yeah, pilgrimage.
Yeah, thank you. So Cancer Kintsugi Camino is the title, and it's a memoir, but it includes poetry, and as the title suggests, it is centered around my experience of having cancer, but also what came before and what came after, including walking on the Camino, including COVID, including a lot of being in the garden and the associations and evocations of working in the soil, being forbidden to garden during cancer treatment. And so trying to be more of a kind of a collage than a single genre or way of looking at life. So, and which I really appreciated too in your collection. I really liked the interplay of the poetry and the prose and the kind of the mundane and the poetic in that regard. It felt really familiar to me.
Yeah, thank you, Shoshana. There's something, so it's so nice, all of us connecting today. I wanted to also just, Jamie, could you just briefly talk about We Are Carbon and how we're like, there are many connections that I think Jamie's gonna put also on the website for Plants and Poetry. Resources for people.
Yeah, I think we've got less than a minute left. So I did put a link in the chat. If everyone wants to click in that, we can go there if this cuts us off. But yeah, so we started working with this organization called We Are Carbon by a woman named Helen Fisher. She uses animations to sort of redirect the story around carbon because there's a lot of negative